On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops, backed by the Soviet Union, unexpectedly invaded South Korea and captured the capital city of Seoul, along with many people. The North Koreans later advanced further into the country, making their way to Busan. This marked the furthest south enemy troops had reached during the span of the war. The Korean Peninsula, which had been under the control of the Japanese for 35 years until their defeat at the end of World War II in 1945, had been divided among the Soviet Union and the United States, each splitting the country at the 38th parallel, marking the borders of the newly formed countries. With the USSR having occupied the north, the south had been left in the hands of the United States.
When word of the invasion made it to the United States on June 27th, President Truman had believed that the invasion had been prompted by Stalin in efforts to challenge the leader of the free world. In response to the pleas for help from the South Korean army, Truman immediately ordered that UN and US troops be sent to their aid without consulting Congress, which was very uncustomary. With the president's order in place, troops that had been stationed in Japan were redirected to South Korea under the command of General MacArthur.
As fighting continued on the Korean Peninsula, Americans back home had been excited and eager to join in the Korean War. By the end of the first week of fighting, public surveys reported that 81% of the American public supported President Truman's decision to aid South Korea in the war, many even saying it was the best decision he had made while in office. The war had marked the first war in which America had been directly involved in fighting against communism, and Americans were excited to defend against it, believing that the war would be an easy victory and short-lived.
Despite the excitement, the war received limited attention in the newspapers and media, especially in the first few years of the war, as many American soldiers who had been fighting in World War II had just returned home to their families. As a result, the Korean War had been dubbed the Forgotten War or the Lost War.
Encouraged by the North Koreans' invasion, UN and South Korean troops pursued North Korean troops over the parallel and captured North Korea's capital, Pyongyang, and imprisoned enemy soldiers and civilians. As fighting ensued for a month, Chinese forces agreed to support North Korean forces and joined in their aid.
In November of 1950, General MacArthur and his troops pushed the North Koreans back to the Yalu River, which marked the border that North Korea shared with China. But 2 days later, Chinese forces, in pursuit of UN and South Korean troops, launched an unplanned counterattack and captured and killed many soldiers. Through a battle that lasted until Christmas, MacArthur's forces retreated back over the line, and Seoul fell captive to the North Koreans and Chinese once again. As more and more soldiers died, many Americans began to doubt their initial excitement and began to slowly retract their support, becoming wary of the war and their standing in it. To combat this, America began spreading propaganda which advocated for people to join the war effort and for the American public to support the war with donations of money and resources. The U.S. also began to rely on citizens' donations and taxation, enacting the Revenue Act of 1950, which increased taxation by 1.3% to continue funding the war, making it increasingly unfavorable for many. Unfortunately, tax increases were not the only increases occurring in the economy. Inflation increased to 5.3% in 1951 during the middle of the war. On the other hand, the GDP of the country had increased by 11%, having been one of the few positive impacts the war had had on the economy. In an effort to combat high inflation rates, Truman issued price and wage controls hoping to lower inflation rates quickly.
President Truman, asking Congress for strong anti-inflation laws, says we must remain strong at home to beat worldwide communism.
And the way to do it is to have an anti-inflation program, including price controls, wage controls, rent controls, credit controls, controls that really hold down prices and the cost of living. When some of us have to make a cut in profits or pass up wage increases we might otherwise get, let us remember that we are making a contribution to the peace of the world. The men who are fighting in Korea would tell us it's a very small contribution after all.
With the Korean War causing distress and unhappiness in America, protests began to form calling for soldiers to be taken out of South Korea and for America to resign from the war as a result of the exponentially increasing death and injury rates. In response, Truman announced on April 15, 1951, that as a result of General MacArthur's insubordination and unwillingness to comply to war policy, would be relieved of his post and would be replaced by General Matthew Ridgway. Truman attributed many of the causes of increasing death rates to General MacArthur and had believed that relieving him of his position would bring the American public some peace of mind.
Though many were unhappy that MacArthur was no longer in control of the army, pleas for America to resign from the war continued. But despite this, Truman insisted that it was appropriate to remain fighting in Korea.
Unfortunately for Truman, Americans were not the only ones that had become tired of the war. In July of 1951, talk of discussions between South Korea's President Syngman Rhee, President Truman, Mao Zedong, and Kim Il-sung surfaced regarding potential methods to end the war.
With their conversations leading nowhere and more news concerning American defeats at the front line, American protests and demonstrations increased, demanding for the war to be brought to an end.
During the 1952 elections between Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson II, politicians took advantage of the disturbed state of Americans and the condition of the war in their campaign. On March 29, 1952, President Truman had stated that he would not be running for a re-election that year. Playing into the wants and hopes of the public, Eisenhower promised to end the Korean War if elected into office. With this promise, Eisenhower won the election with 442 electoral votes and majority popular votes. Keeping to his promise, he took immediate action once in office and began consultation with North Korea, South Korea, the Soviet Union, the UN, and American allies to not only pull America out of the war, but to end the war in its entirety.
Americans had been extremely overjoyed to have seen progress being made to end the war. With Eisenhower in charge, fighting had died down in Korea, along with the worries of the people in the U.S. Seeing the progress he had made, Americans began to regain hope that fighting would eventually come to an end. On July 27, 1953, agreement between the Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteers resulted in an armistice that formally ended the Korean War. This armistice also suspended further hostility between the Koreas, withdrew military forces from around the 40,000-meter-wide zone, now known as the DMZ, established agencies to make sure terms of the armistice were not violated, and released all imprisoned and displaced persons. Not only had the Korean War further broken the two Koreas' relations, America's relations with countries involved in the war also changed, some for better and some for worse. After the end of the war, South Korea and the United States had become extremely close allies. In October of 1953, officials from both South Korea and the United States met and discussed criteria for the creation of a mutual defense treaty. After further deliberation, the official treaty was created and signed, forging a security alliance between the two. Despite the countries' improved relations, those of the United States, USSR, and North Korea deeply worsened.
As North Korea and the U.S. had been on opposite sides during the war, tensions had been at a high while each were trying to stop the other from gaining control of their respective sides of the Korean peninsula. The Soviet Union's involvement, assistance, and control in North Korea did not help improve relations by any means, as the United States disliked the Soviet Union, and they already had strained relations. North Korea and the United States had abstained from further communication after the war, with their first post-war conversation having occurred years the war had ceased. Their negotiation regarding nuclear power, mostly in the form of weapons or for the use of destruction, did not go very far, as the negotiation did not result in any alliances or major improvements for either country. As both countries were still upset by the Korean War, no diplomatic relations were established between the two countries.
Along with changes in relations came changes in society and culture. Unlike during the time of the war, the job market in America had become stable, and the economy had experienced a major boom, mostly in showbiz. Hollywood had lit up again, creating many hit shows such as I Love Lucy and Dragnet. The Korean War had also inspired the hit TV series MASH, which appeared in the 70s and reflected on the lives of military personnel during the Korean War. With increase in entertainment, televisions had made their way into people's homes, with 3/4 of American households having TVs in them after the end of the Korean War.
The Korean War had been a long 3 years for all involved, including the United States and its citizens. It had resulted in extreme bloodshed, holding a place in history as one of the most deadly wars, and had caused political and economical strain and uncertainty. Though the ceasefire may have ended the brutal war between the two countries, the goal to reunite the two was not achieved, as the Korean peninsula still remains divided to this day.